Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to do one of my favourite videos of any given year, which is my best books of 2025 so far. We are down 6 months, we've got 6 more to go, and so it's time to have a little check-in to see some of the brilliant books that I have read so far this year, and anticipate greatly some of the great reading that I have ahead of me. I have 8 books to show you today, but I also have 2 honorary mentions. The first of these being a book that I actually reread in 2025. It wasn't a first-time read for me, though I'm going to say that it counts because the first time that I read this book was actually December 2024, so a month shy of 2025. And that book is Winterang, The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times by Katherine May. So as I say, I first read this book back in December of 2024. I really enjoyed it, but on reflection, potentially didn't get quite as much out of it as I did on a reread in 2025, because when I was reading it, it was on the run up to Christmas. I was feeling very festive, I was feeling very happy. And so this book, with its message of getting through hard times, was not really applicable to me. However, in January of 2025, I had a couple of setbacks in a row, a couple of not very nice things happen, and I decided that I should give this a reread, that this might have a little bit more for me now that I was in a period of wintering myself. In this book, May explores this concept of wintering, looking at the changing seasons from summer to autumn to winter and how nature responds to those changes. But it's also thinking about wintering metaphorically through periods of hardship. She is particularly looking at times of illness, of grief and isolation. It's a combination of nature writing, of memoir. She's looking at different allusions to wintering within literature, and it's a book that is a real antidote to the often counter-narrative that we have in society of being productive at all times. This book is actually suggesting that it is completely natural and something that we as humans have lost, to embrace these periods of isolation, of quietness, of just taking things slow. And I just found it a very reassuring read at a time where I wasn't feeling my best. Another honourable mention is Ultraprocessed People, Why Do We All Eat Stuff That Isn't Food and Why Can't We Stop by Chris van Tulleken. Now, the reason that I have this as an honourable mention rather than a best book of the year is because I will admit that the reading experience of this was, it was fine, but I ultimately would say that if you're going to engage with this book, number one, I would do it on audio because the audiobook has additional chapters, interviews that he's doing with various people, including his brother. And I would also recommend listening to Chris van Tulleken on podcast, because I think especially as his book tour went on, the more he was promoting this book, I feel like he refined some of his arguments even further. He has responded really well to criticisms that he has had on this book, particularly when it comes to discussions around orthorexia and other eating disorders. In this book, Chris van Tulleken is talking about ultra-processed foods, industrial products that are put into these foods, additives, emulsifiers, preservatives, things that you wouldn't typically find in your domestic kitchen, to make them last longer, to make them more palatable, to make them hyper palatable, and to make sure that you consume as much as possible. There's a clear distinction between processed foods, so things that we would cook, or raw ingredients that have other ingredients added to them, and these ultra processed foods that have these ingredients. And he goes through the damage that these products can do to our health, and why it is that governments and companies have no incentive to take these products out of our food despite the damage that they are doing to us. This is not what I feared it was going to be, which is very much blaming the individual. It is more blaming organisations, companies and governments, and holding them to account. And as a result, I found it to be a much more balanced book than I was expecting. I thought it was going to be very fear-mongering. As I say, I thought it was going to be very much blaming individuals for their choices, but he is very, very conscious of the various disparities that would mean that ultra-processed food is, for a lot of people, their only option for food. It is very accessible, it is very cheap, at least compared to a diet that would be entirely non-ultra-processed. One of the reasons I'm adding this to my list is that I cannot doubt the effect that reading this book has had on my own life. I have definitely taken a lot of messages from this book and implemented it into my own food. The thing I want to stress with this is that it is not a diet book, but rather commentary and criticism on our food industry. And now going into the 8 books on my best books of the year so far list. Firstly, we have A Little Trickery by Rosanna Pike, which I do believe is the only book that I have read from the Women's Prize long list so far, and I was very surprised to see it didn't make it onto the shortlist. This is a work of historical fiction which is set in Tudor England in the year 1500, and we are following the main character of Tib Ingleby, who we meet as a young girl after her mother tragically dies in childbirth. Tib's sister, who was fathered by a local farmer who would refuse to acknowledge the child. In her grief and in a moment of desperation, Tib decides to set fire to the farmer's house and runs away with the baby in tow. She ends up meeting a homeless boy called Ivo, and the two of them travel together looking for a place to call their home. Eventually, Ivo and Tib would be separated, but Tib would come across a group of travelling performers. And upon the discovery that Tib has her own special skill, she can contort herself into the smallest of places, she is offered offered a position in their troupe. And with this book, we have this story of found family. All of these characters are outcasts in their own way and give Tib a sense of community that she's never experienced before. While Tib is travelling through Tudor England, she is struck by evidence of religious and political corruption, the poverty of those around her, and the unfair power dynamics from the poorest in society, and the cruel treatment doled out at them by the powers that be. Towards the end of the book, Tib sets out a plan, devising a way of taking advantage of the authorities and their superstitions to her own and her friends' benefit. What I love about this is that Tib has just a very, very strong narrative voice, and I would definitely recommend listening to this on audio to get a sense of that. She can be incredibly naive at times, but you definitely feel her growing through the course of the book, and there are moments of profound wisdom that come from someone so young. Seeing her evolve and change and mature through the book was one of my favourite aspects of this book. The strength of this is definitely in the band of characters that she meets along the way, the very claustrophobic atmosphere of Tudor England from the perspective of somebody who is lower down the pecking order, rather than what I do typically do, which is read a lot about royalty from this time period. This was definitely a refreshing change of pace for me, and I really appreciated it. I did feel like there were some issues with the pacing of this book. As I say, the Little Trickery, awful Little Trickery, happens about 2/3 of the way through the book, and at moments you are left feeling like things are dragging on, that they're a little bit slow. However, I did come to appreciate the pacing of this book by the end, because Rosanna Pike is very masterful at making sure that every little breadcrumb that she leaves throughout the book is eventually answered by the end, and that was definitely satisfying. The next book is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. Yes, I know, so many people were raving about this book last year, and they were absolutely right to do so. Set in 412 BC in Syracuse, following one of the battles of the Peloponnesian War, Sicily has had an unexpected victory, which has meant that a bunch of Athenian prisoners have been left to rot in the quarries of Syracuse, left out in the hot sun to die slowly of exposure and starvation. Our main characters are actually not some of these Athenians, but actually two Syracusan men down on their luck, Lampo and Gellin, who, despite their enthusiasm for the Sicilian win, are slightly concerned that with the deaths of these Athenians, and should Athens lose the war, the Athenian drama, which they so love, is going to be lost. In a desperate attempt to preserve this culture for the future generations, Gellin comes up with a plan, which is that he is going to use some of these Athenian prisoners and have them put on a production of Medea, offering food as payment for the Athenians' involvement. An offer that, considering they would die if they don't accept this help, is really not a choice for them at all. What stands out immediately from this book is the Dublin dialect that Ferdia Lennon uses to characterise the Syracusans. It makes it feel very immediate, it makes it feel very modern despite its setting. The tone of this book is so striking. It is both comic and dark, which can be very, very jarring, but also very, very memorable. The comedy and the humour coming from the Syracusans, who are both endearing in some way because you want them to do well, but also you realise how ignorant they are, how they do not recognise how casually they are dehumanising these Athenians and just whittling down to props for their own entertainment. There really is a thin line between comedy and cruelty. It's a very brutal story. There's some real consequences for these characters' actions, and the book at no point shies away from this. It's one that may not be for everybody, but I definitely found very affecting. Next up, we have Mary the First Queen of Sorrows by Alison Weir. As you'll know, I have been a big fan of Alison Weir's historical fiction. I've read her 6 Tudor Queen series. I have been making my way through the Tudor Roses series, which started with Elizabeth of York. It then carried on to Henry VIII, and now looking at the life of Mary I, who is often known to history as Bloody Mary. This book traces the rather tumultuous life of Mary I, from her childhood in the Tudor court, witnessing her mother Catherine of Aragon's fall from grace, as her father tried to get their marriage annulled, leading to Mary's position as princess being tenuous and precarious with the ups and downs in the king's mood and the mood of whoever his wife was at the time. Through all of this tumult, we see Mary growing even more fervent in her Catholic faith. We see the emotional and physical toll that this back and forth in her fortunes takes on her. We see her clashing further with her brother Edward, who takes the throne and throws the country into more of a Protestant regime, and how that really clashes with Mary's own Catholic beliefs. We see after Edward dies, Mary having to fight for the throne against the factions that want to put Lady Jane Grey in her place. Her eventual triumph, but even after she has achieved the throne, her position is still far from easily won. The fragility of her position, being Catholic in a country that has been embracing Protestantism, and her own emotional turmoil, having recently married but knowing that without an heir to her throne, the country is just going to slide back into Protestantism, and how that leads to some of the horrific acts that she would go on to persecute against Protestants. And Weir really doesn't shy away from these darker aspects of Mary's regime, mainly the torture and execution of Protestants. It was really interesting to read this book, and particularly the author's note, where Weir talks very candidly about the fact that while she could relate to Mary during the early parts of her life, particularly she, as Alison Weir herself, is a child of divorce and knows the effect that that can have on a child's psyche, especially when the parents are not on good terms. How she increasingly, as Mary went on in her life, and particularly once she took the throne, found it very hard to sympathise with her. And so it was quite a difficult novel for her to write. And as a result, she could never truly be on her side. And that definitely does come through here. You can feel Alison Weir really, really trying with this narrative not to sympathise too much or to have the reader sympathise with her too much. But yeah, I really enjoyed coming back to Alison Weir through this very, very tricky, complex figure who, like Alison Weir, I never always agreed with the things that she did, but I could definitely understand how she got there. Next up, another historical fiction novel that I loved was Costanza by Rachel Blackmore. This is set in 1630s Rome and is following the main character of Costanza Piccolomini, the wife of an ambitious sculptor who is working under Lorenzo Bernini. Bernini initially is a patron to her husband, but becomes more enthralled by Costanza. And when he sees Costanza's potential, he offers her lessons, an opportunity to learn more about art and history, which as a very, very repressed Italian woman in this time period, she readily accepts. Getting a chance to break away from society's norms and restrictions on women, and getting a chance to really learn and have some freedom for herself. But the more time that Bernini and Costanza spend together, the more clear it is that there is an attraction brewing, and this leads to a scandalous love affair, being conducted with the permission and the consent of Costanza's husband, but very clearly rocking Roman society. However, this love and this freedom is not to last. Costanza is later wrongly accused of adultery against Bernini, and it is at this point that the novel takes a chilling and brutal turn. And the narrative shift in this book is horrific and incredibly sad, but very much grounded in the real life events that happened to Costanza. This book is deeply immersive, rich in its tension and its atmosphere of this time period. Costanza is so compelling. She is a non-conforming woman, but she never belittles the other women around her or judges them for their choices. This book is looking at themes such as the dangers of childbirth and the importance of female solidarity and the limited means of safety that women had in this time period in a very patriarchal world. The next book to talk about is Henry V, The Astonishing Rise of England's Greatest Warrior King by Dan Jones. Because I've read Dan Jones before, I have read Power and Thrones by this author, I've read Magna Carta, and I have recently read and enjoyed his Essex Dogs books. I was expecting to quite like this, but because, you know, Henry V has never been a figure of whom I'm particularly enamoured, I'm not really a war girl, and, you know, the ultimate warrior king just didn't really appeal to me, but I was willing to let Dan Jones give it a go. So as you can imagine, the fact that this ended up quite high up on the list of favourite books of the year is quite surprising to me. And this is a really, really engaging but also really accessible biography of this figure. We're going through Henry's life from his youth up to his death in 1422. And Dan Jones is really intent in showing the man behind all of the myth of Shakespeare, this famed leader of the legendary Battle of Agincourt. And in order to build up this character for Henry, Dan Jones makes this very deliberate choice to start his kingship midway through the book, which means that we have a real good build-up of the boy and the man that Henry V would grow up as and would become. And having that time to really think about his early life and the influence of the adults around him, particularly Richard II, who his father Henry IV would usurp, the tensions within the young Henry and his father really paid off. It made this figure, who I have often found quite inaccessible, come to life. Another choice that Dan Jones makes in this is that he tells it in present tense, so everything feels very immediate. It makes it feel modern, it makes it feel alive. Henry V feels like a real human being who you are seeing him make decisions in the real time, which is a lot to say for a figure who often just seems aloof and a little bit too perfect. In this, he becomes a lot more relatable and a lot more complex. So yes, once again, for somebody like myself who isn't really a big fan of war narratives, of military history, the fact that Dan Jones was able to make me get on board with this very, very military figure, quite remarkable. Next up, we have First Time Caller by B.K. Borison. So First Time Caller is the first book in a new series that is going to be written by B.K. Borison, where all of the plots are based around Nora Ephron movies. This first one is based around Sleepless in Seattle, which I will not lie is not my favourite. I just can't really get on board with a romance where the two main characters don't meet until right at the end. But thankfully, clearly B.K. Borison thought the same thing, because while this story is adapted from Sleepless in Seattle, our two main characters have a lot of time together, speaking to each other, working at each other's personalities, and that made it very, very enjoyable for me. This story follows Aidan, who is the host of the Heartstrings radio show. His show is all about love, romance, relationships, and incorporates call-ins where he gives romantic advice. However, there is one problem, and that is that Aidan has fallen out of love with love, and so is finding as a result that his show is suffering. However, one night a young girl calls into the show, a young school-aged daughter who is calling on behalf of her mother, concerned that her mother hasn't been on a date for many years, and and she's just worried. She wants her mother to find love. This mother, Lucy, ends up discovering her daughter on the phone to a strange man who she doesn't know, and as you can imagine is horrified to find out that this phone call is being broadcast live on the radio. However, Aidan is able to talk her down a little bit, make her feel more comfortable, and they start to discuss her love life, and it is clear that there is a real rapport and banter between Aidan and Lucy. The audience thinks so, and Aidan's producers think so, because they invite Lucy to be a regular feature of the programme, with Aidan talking to her and scoping out potential prospects for dates, with the hope of finding Lucy her true love. However, as you can imagine, because this is a romance book, it's clear that the sparks are really flying between Aidan and Lucy. Can they keep up this charade of him trying to matchmake her when they are really falling for each other behind the scenes? And I just thought this book was so charming and so lovely. I also love the depiction of family in here. Lucy is a single mother, but she is not raising her daughter entirely alone. She is still close with her ex, and their relationship is just so refreshingly healthy and respectful. They are no longer together, they are no longer romantically attached, but as parents they are a team. And I just never see that kind of relationship depicted quite so healthily and quite so tenderly as it is in this book. It was a really welcome change from the common narrative. And this whole story is just grounded in so much kindness, in respect, in giving each other space to be emotionally vulnerable, all the while also being funny. It's just a lovely, lovely sweet romance, which I definitely fell for myself. Penultimate book on this list is Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Atmosphere follows the main character of Joan, who is a physics and astronomy professor who eventually ends up on track to join NASA's space shuttle program, with the aim of becoming one of the first female astronauts. Set in the 1980s and through two different timelines, we are seeing both Joan's rise through NASA, her undergoing her strict and rigorous training, her meeting her fellow applicants along the way and making friends. We're also seeing a second timeline in 1984, where Joan is actually serving as the capsule communicator of a space shuttle mission that has gone wrong, devastating Joan, as pretty much everybody who is on this mission is somebody that she grew up in the program with, all friends of hers, and may not all make it back alive. As I say, she developed some deep friendships along the way, working her way up at NASA, and this book is really about two loves of her life, one being romantic but another being familial, her deep love for her niece Frances, and Joan's struggle seeing her sister becoming increasingly neglectful of Frances in favour of a new husband. As I say, we also have the relationship between Joan and her friend and later lover Vanessa, and how they struggle navigating their relationship in the 1980s, both working at NASA, knowing that there are a lot of eyes on them, and this is a deeply homophobic culture. How can their love possibly last if it has to forever be a secret? I just love the character work in here. You know, I'm not a very scientific person, so I wasn't sure what I was going to make of this, but thankfully Taylor Jenkins Reid also puts in so much work towards her characters that absolutely pulled me through this book, and I was so incredibly invested. I love the romantic storyline, but I also really deeply appreciated the relationship between Joan and her niece. As an auntie myself, I felt myself getting very, very frustrated reading about this family dynamic where we've got this sister who is incredibly narcissistic and just is one of those parents who believes that because they gave their child life, that means that that child owes them something. That is an attitude that I can never get behind. I find it deeply upsetting, and I could just viscerally feel Joan's frustration wanting to do something but knowing that she has very little power. I thought it was wonderful, and also I feel like I'm not hearing a lot of people talking about this, which for a Taylor Jenkins Reid novel feels wrong, and I can only presume it's because people haven't picked it up yet, so please do. A book that I know a lot of people picked up and is so far I would say my favourite book of the year. I've mentioned it a lot, you can probably see it coming from a mile away. It is Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. I didn't think in the year 2025 that the Hunger Games series would still be having such a large hold over my life, but here we go. This is the second prequel that Suzanne Collins has written of the world of Panem, the first of those being The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which was looking at the 10th Hunger Games through the perspective of Coriolanus Snow, who of course is the president and main villain of the original trilogy. In this book we are looking at the 50th Hunger Games, the second quarter quell, and we are looking at the games of Haymitch Abernathy, who in the original Hunger Games is mentor to District 12, mentor to Katniss and Peter, who we know at the start of his books had a dark past, had a traumatic games, following 24 years of having to mentor various District 12 tributes who wouldn't make it out alive. And it was funny going into this because I remember from reading Catching Fire, that we actually get to see a glimpse of Haymitch's games. And I remember thinking before I went into this book, how is Suzanne Collins going to be able to build the tension for a story that we know how it's going to end? We know that Haymitch wins. We even know what the Capitol end up doing to his family. So how can you continue tension in a book where we know the outcome? However, I shouldn't have doubted Suzanne Collins and her ability to pull this off, because she did so and did so masterfully. And it's through this main commentary on propaganda and perception we come to realise that the games that we thought we knew were actually a little bit different, and what the Capital have put out about these games may not have been the truth. The story that we thought we know has been heavily manipulated by the Capital. Haymitch is a very different protagonist to Coriolanus Snow or to Katniss Everdeen. He is snarky, he is blunt, he is dismissive of authority, but at the same time there is this underlying thread of complicity and passive submission. He is not fully the revolutionary that we want for this world and would ultimately get with Katniss, even though admittedly begrudgingly. We see Haymitch frequently throughout this book being challenged to recognise the injustice of this system, and while he can recognise it, he doesn't actually act, or at least in moments where he does act, he doesn't act quite as fully as you would want him to. There are lots of callbacks in this book to previous games, to previous characters that we know from the original series, which when I saw them originally I thought, oh god, is this just going to be fan service? Is this necessary? But actually by the time we got to the end of the book I was like, oh no, absolutely, this all completely fits in. I'm so glad to get more of an insight into these characters that we had met in the original series. I have a deeper insight to them now. It's actually enriched my understanding of them. And this is a prequel that doesn't just, add little details here and there to the original trilogy, but it actually enhances it. It makes it better. Our understanding of this world is so much richer for the inclusion of this book. It doesn't feel like a cash grab to me. It feels like Suzanne Collins was waiting for the right time to release these details. This plot doesn't feel like an afterthought. It doesn't feel like she's trying to cram in details that weren't originally there. It just feels like now is the time that we had to learn them. And I really appreciate that. I read this book when it came out, pretty much on the day of release, and then I immediately bought the audiobook because I wasn't done with it. Went back to the beginning, started it again. That's how much I enjoyed this, and I am very much looking forward to seeing the film when it comes out next year. So there we go, those are all of the books that I have to show you for my best books of 2025 so far. Does my list match up with any of yours? I would love to hear from you, and also please let me know about some of the best books that you've read in 2025 so far. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.